They found her barefoot in a field, clothes torn, eyes as if they hadn't blinked in days. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just flinched at light and turned away from every human touch. No one knew her name. The file said Jane Doe, another case in a world too busy to look deeper. But one dog did. Kael didn't bark. He didn't charge or sniff like others might. He simply lay down beside her, tail still, eyes fixed, guarding something only he could sense. A soul still trapped in fear. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about how he changed everything. How a German shepherd uncovered what entire institutions ignored. And how, in the end, it wasn't noise or sirens or guns that saved a child, but the silence of a partner who refused to leave. Stay with this story. It doesn't start loud, but it ends where few stories dare to go. The truth behind what was meant to stay hidden. The night the raid went down, the sky above Echelon's industrial zone was the color of gunmetal clouds, low, heavy, like they, too, were holding their breath. Sergeant Nora Vance sat crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her pulse steady, eyes scanning the perimeter through her thermal visor. The warehouse across the lot looked abandoned from the outside, no lights, no movement, but she knew better. Inside was a suspected trafficking ring that had eluded capture for over 6 months. Intel said this was where they kept inventory before moving them out through underground rail lines. At her side, Kael waited, silent, alert. His ears twitched with every sound. He was a German shepherd, built like a statue carved from loyalty, his body lean and scarred, trained for urban entry and scent detection. His breath came slow, focused. Nora gave a subtle hand signal. Advance! They moved as one, her shadow in his. Nora's boots whispered against the gravel. Kael's paws never made a sound. At the warehouse's side entrance, she knelt, checked the locket had already been cut. That wasn't part of the plan. She glanced down. Kael's gaze met hers, and something in his posture shifted, not fear, but hesitation, like he smelled something she couldn't, something old, foul. She drew her weapon. Inside, the air was humid and stank of bleach and decay. The warehouse floor stretched out into half-lit corridors and partitioned rooms. Nora led. Kael followed close, nose to the ground, body low. She could hear a low mechanical hum, the faint clink of something metal, and then voices. 3, maybe 4 men, foreign language, nervous. Kael stopped at a crate and growled deep, guttural, almost primal. That sound wasn't part of training. She crouched, reached for her comms. That's when the floor vibrated, just a thrum at first, then again, harder. "Tripwire," she whispered, just as Kael lunged. The explosion came a heartbeat later, a scream of light. The shockwave hit her like a fist. Her back slammed against the concrete. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, just the ringing, the deafening, soul-splitting ringing, and then smoke, fire, sirens in the distance. She coughed, tried to sit up. Blood trickled from her temple. Her shoulder throbbed, likely dislocated. But all she could think was, Kael. She turned. He was lying 10 feet away, body twisted awkwardly near the blown-out wall. Debris covered his flank. One of his hind legs bent at a sickening angle. The vest he wore, charred, torn butt still intact over his chest. Nora crawled to him, dragging her useless arm. "Kael," she choked out, but he didn't move. Her fingers touched his fur, burned in places, still warm. Hey, no, you stay with me," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. Her free hand reached for her radio. Officer down, Kane down. We need med-evac now. Coordinates. Her voice cracked. Now, damn it! Kael stirred. Barely. One eye blinked open, cloudy. His chest rose, shallow. You stupid, stubborn boy, she said, tears falling freely now. Why'd you do that? Because you wouldn't have made it otherwise. That's what his eyes said. Even through the pain. Even when every breath was borrowed time. She looked around. Smoke was curling up toward the rafters. The fire had started somewhere in the south wing. The gunmen were gone or dead. Footsteps approached. Blue and red lights flashed beyond the wreckage. But all she could see was the dog who never left her side. The dog who chose fire over fear. She wrapped her arms around him, cradled him like a fallen soldier. And in that broken, burning warehouse, where screams had echoed and darkness had nested, Nora Vance screamed a name that wasn't just a call sign. It was a plea, a prayer, a promise. Kael! The fluorescent lights above flickered with a mechanical hum, too bright for a room that had already seen too much pain. Nora sat at the edge of the hospital cot, her elbows on her knees, her uniform still marked with soot along the sleeves. Her badge had been wiped clean, but the rest of her eyes, hands, spine carried what soap couldn't scrub out. Kael lay motionless on a padded recovery mat beside the bed. A series of IV tubes threaded through the fur of his foreleg. His breathing was shallow, steady. The lower half of his body, his powerful hindquarters, once trained to leap over fences and restrain grown men, was limp, flaccid. A reality that none of the doctors had to say out loud anymore. They'd said it earlier that morning, quietly but firmly. Spinal trauma, complete paralysis below L2, permanent. Nora hadn't answered. She couldn't. Her gaze had been fixed on Kael's eyes, still alert, still tracking her every movement. They hadn't dulled, not yet. But she feared the day they would. A soft knock came at the door. Captain Evers entered, hat in hand. Behind him were two officers in dress blues, flanking a man in a pressed gray suit. Someone from City Council. "We're not staying long," the captain said gently. "We just wanted to do this right." Nora rose, slowly, wincing at her still bruised ribs. She hadn't been released yet, but had refused to leave Kael's room. They formed a half circle around the bed. One of the officers opened a small velvet case and withdrew two medals. One was for her, the Medal of Valor, presented with a hollow nod and a photo taken for the press that never came. The other, smaller, engraved with a K9 insignia, was for Kael. Nora accepted both, but didn't pin them on. Instead, she walked over to Kael and knelt. Her fingers moved gently as she pinned the smaller medal to his service vest, just above the tear from the explosion. Kael didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward hers and held. No barking, no whine, just the quiet language of two soldiers who didn't need words anymore. The men behind her murmured a few things: hero, sacrifice, example to the force. But it all sounded like paper rustling, distant, unnecessary. What mattered had already happened in that warehouse. After a few minutes, the room cleared, leaving only Nora, Kael, and the humming of machines that were keeping him comfortable. She sat down again, looked at him. "They want to transfer you," she said softly, "out of the KN unit into permanent shelter care, full disability classification." Kael blinked. Her jaw tensed. They said it like it was a kindness, like you've already been filed away. Her fingers brushed over the scar on his chest, the spot where shrapnel had torn into his flesh. She had memorized its outline, could trace it with her eyes closed. "You saved me," she whispered, "and I wasn't even fast enough to save your legs." She hated the way her voice broke on that last word, hated it more when Kael nudged his muzzle weakly toward her thigh, as if to comfort her. "No," she said quickly, fiercely. "You don't do that. You don't get to forgive me." Outside the window, sirens wailed in the distance, faint like echoes from another life. The city was still spinning, still breaking. But in this small room, time had stopped. She stood, crossed to the cabinet, opened the folder marked Discharge Transfer Recommendations. Without hesitation, she ripped it in half, then again, then again. The sound of tearing paper was louder than anything the councilman had said. When she turned back to Kael, her eyes were clear. "You're not going anywhere," she said. "You're coming home with me." She didn't care what the precinct thought. Didn't care if they stripped her title, her pension, her standing. The dog lying beside her hadn't just taken shrapnel. He had taken the weight of a decision no one else would have made. He had chosen her life over his own future, and she would spend every breath she had making sure he never thought, not even once, that it was a mistake. She lowered the hospital bed rail, knelt down, and pressed her forehead against his. "From now on," she whispered, "I carry what you can't." Kael exhaled a soft, tired breath. And in that sterile hospital room, without applause, without cameras, without an audience to bear witness, a vow was made between soldier and soul. It would not be the last. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, but Nora hesitated before opening the door. She hadn't been home in 16 days. When she finally pushed it open, the scent hit her first, lavender and dust. A scent that used to calm her. Now it just felt foreign, like she was stepping into someone else's life. Kael's crate sat in the passenger seat of her car, its door unlatched. She didn't use the ramp the hospital provided. Instead, she scooped her partner into her arms, awkward, careful, and trembling from the weight that wasn't just physical. The first step inside was the hardest. She carried him past the doorway, through the narrow hall that had once echoed with the sound of paws sprinting to greet her. Now it was quiet, hollow. No eager claws, no joyful bark, just breath hers and his unsteady, shared and strained. She laid him gently on a new orthopedic bed, placed just inside the living room where the fireplace still held the ghost of last winter's heat. Kael didn't whimper, didn't move. He just blinked once, then stared at the ceiling like it held answers. Nora sat down on the couch, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. Her apartment wasn't large, just enough for one person who lived like she was always between storms. Framed medals lined the hallway wall. One of them was crooked. She hadn't noticed it until now. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was dense. A silence born of things neither of them could say out loud, of the way his body no longer responded past the waist, of the way her hand still trembled when it reached for door handles, unsure what waited behind them. She turned on the fireplace, not for warmth, but for the light. Kael's eyes shifted toward the flicker. He used to love lying in front of it, his own safe haven after long shifts. She watched him try to shift closer, only for his back legs to drag limply behind him. He stopped, looked at her, and something inside her cracked. "I'll move it," she whispered. She pulled the whole bed carefully, slowly closer to the fire, closer to where he used to lie. He didn't wag his tail, didn't lift his head, but he let out a breath. And somehow that meant everything. That night, Nora lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling, fist clenched under the covers. The window was slightly open. Cold air slipped in, brushing her cheeks. Kael was just down the hall, separated by 20 steps. It should have been enough, but sleep didn't come. Somewhere in that half-dream world between memory and noise, the past crept in. She was back in the warehouse, the explosion again, the heat, the weight of debris, Kael's body too still, her voice hoarse from screaming his name over and over, the hiss of metal, sirens, blood on her hands, hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She woke up with a start, heart pounding, sheets damp, her breath caught between now and then. Then she heard it, a low, pitiful whine, barely audible. "Kael." She threw off the covers and moved quickly down the hallway. He was awake, his head twitching, eyes big but glassy, his body stiff, breathing shallow. Dreaming, reliving something. Nora dropped to her knees beside his bed. "Kael," she whispered, stroking his ear gently. "You're home, you're safe." The whine subsided, but his eyes didn't close, neither did hers. She sat with him for almost an hour, hand on his side, counting breaths like they were the only way to keep herself grounded. And when the tremors in his legs stopped, those ghost signals from a spine that no longer listened, she stood, then paused. She didn't go back to her room. Instead, she returned moments later with her blankets, a pillow, and one decision. She pulled Kael's bed, his entire setup, into her bedroom, placed it next to hers, where she could see him, hear him, reach him if needed. She didn't care if it made her look unhinged. She didn't care that the space was tight. What she cared about was that he never had to sleep alone again. She lay back down, pulled the covers over her chest. Kael blinked once, twice. Then finally, he sighed. Not a whimper, not a cry, just the sound of something small letting go. And as the moonlight settled across the floor in pale silver streaks, Nora whispered aloud to the shadows between them, "We got out? But we didn't come home whole, did we?" Kael didn't answer. He didn't have to. The morning sunlight crept into the kitchen like it didn't know whether it was welcome. Nora stood at the counter pouring a second cup of coffee she wouldn't finish. Her eyes were puffy, not from sleep, but the lack of it. Behind her, Kael lay in his rolling support bed near the window, wrapped in the soft orange blanket he'd claimed during rehab. His head was up, but barely. One ear twitched toward the television. The volume was low. She'd only turned it on for background noise, but a word made her still mid-pour. "Missing." She set the mug down. On screen, a photo. A girl, 16, maybe 17, big eyes, long dark hair, the kind of smile that looked like it had to fight through years of silence to show itself. Maya Sandoval, missing since Tuesday. Authorities report the teen failed to return home after a routine counseling session at the Mindbridge Wellness Center. No signs of forced abduction. The case is currently being treated as a possible runaway. Nora's jaw clenched. She knew that name, Sandoval. She grabbed the remote and unmuted the sound. The news anchor's voice was calm, polished, too neat for what it was saying. Sources say the girl was undergoing regular trauma therapy related to early childhood events. Officials believe emotional distress may be a factor in her disappearance. A new image replaced the photo. Security footage of Maya walking into a building. Mined Bridge, time stamped, late afternoon. A receptionist smiled as she passed through the glass door. There was no footage of her coming out. Nora's stomach turned. Something about the name wouldn't let go. She walked to the kitchen drawer, pulled out the tattered manila folder she hadn't touched in years, her own private archive of cases no one else seemed to care about. It didn't take long. She flipped past mugshots, intake reports, scribbled notes in her own shorthand. And then there it was. Esperanza Sandoval, Maya's mother, a trafficking survivor. Nora had pulled out of a basement apartment in West Echelon almost 8 years ago. Back then, Esperanza had barely spoken, but she had clung to a child's drawing folded in quarters, a crayon sketch of a girl with long hair and a blue dress. Her daughter, Maya. The child had only been 5 at the time. Nora remembered the way Esperanza had begged for the system to protect Maya. She sees things she doesn't understand, she'd said, and the world is already trying to teach her the wrong names for them. Now, Maya was gone, disappeared, without struggle, without noise. Nora turned off the TV. She walked to Kael and knelt beside him. "You remember Esperanza?" she asked. Kael's ear perked again. That name stirred something, faint but real. He'd been there on that raid. He'd been the one to find the locked door behind the curtain, the one with the child's toy stuffed into the door jamb. "Her daughter's missing," she murmured. Kael's eyes locked on hers, then flicked toward the TV, which had gone to commercial. His body didn't move, but something behind his gaze did. That old alertness, the one that preceded danger. Nora swallowed. She picked up her phone and tried Esperanza's last known number. Disconnected. Her fingers hovered over the keys before dialing the local precinct. After 2 rings, an officer picked up. Routine voice. "Civilian line." "I'm calling about Maya Sandoval," Nora said, trying to keep her voice measured. "I worked her mother's case years ago. Maya's disappearance doesn't sit right." There was a pause. The officer replied, "We've looked into it. She walked into her therapy session and never walked out. No signs of foul play, no ransom, no witnesses. We're treating it as a standard teenage runaway." Nora gritted her teeth. You don't walk into a monitored building in daylight and vanish without someone noticing. The camera feed glitched. Tech said it was nothing. "Look, if she turns up, we'll update the bulletin." He hung up before she could press further. Kael gave a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, just a breath between tension and instinct. She looked at him. "It's happening again," she whispered. "Only this time, no one's listening." She stood, suddenly aware of the room's silence, the kind that stretched too long, the kind that feels like a warning. She went back to her desk, pulled out a notepad, and scrawled 3 words. Mind Bridge. Esperanza. Glitch. Then, without hesitating, she added the 4th. Sour inks? Kael's head rose slightly. Somewhere deep in her gut a memory stirred, one she'd buried, one she hadn't wanted to believe had a future. But now it had a name and a missing girl. The afternoon sun bled through the blinds in fractured lines, striping the hardwood floor like silent prison bars. Nora sat cross-legged on the rug, her old case files spread out in chaotic arcs around her reports, timelines, arrest records, witness transcripts. The air was thick with dust and the unspoken truth that something bigger was coiling beneath the surface. Kael lay nearby in his bed, head resting between his front paws. He'd barely stirred since the morning, but Nora had noticed the shift, not in his posture, but in his eyes. He was watching her again, not out of habit, out of attention. She pulled the printed photo of Maya from the folder cropped from the missing persons report, her face clear, eyes wide, but unreadable. She held it in her hand for a long time, trying to see what Kael might see, and then she turned it toward him. At first, nothing. Then his body tensed. One ear flicked up, then both. Kael pushed himself up with effort, his front legs trembling slightly from the strain. He sniffed the air once, then again, and then a low guttural growl built in his chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective, like the sound he used to make when spotting someone with a weapon across the room before anyone else noticed. Nora blinked. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, heart suddenly tight in her chest. Kael's eyes were locked on the photo. No hesitation, no confusion. Just focus, sharp and narrowed like a laser. His breath had quickened. Nora leaned closer. "Do you know her?" Kael didn't break his stare. She placed the photo on the floor, inching it toward him. He growled again, quieter this time, less warning, more resistance, as if some part of him was fighting an instinct he didn't fully understand. Then he pawed at the photo, not to destroy it, to cover it. Nora froze. She'd seen that behavior once before, years ago, when Kael had intercepted a suspect reaching for a weapon tucked in a child's backpack. He'd moved without a command, placing his body between the child and the threat. He hadn't attacked, he'd protected. Now, staring at Maya's photo, he was doing the same thing. Only there was no suspect, no weapon, just a face frozen in time and a dog whose instincts had never once steered her wrong. Something about Maya was activating him, not in aggression, but in defense. Nora sat back slowly, pulse rising. "Kael," she said again gently, "are you telling me she's in danger?" He turned to look at her. His eyes were wet, not in pain, in memory, and she felt it not as a hunch, not as a guess, but as something deeper, something primal. He knew. She reached for her notebook and wrote it down in large, uneven letters. "Kael recognizes her," then added a second line. "This isn't just a missing person. This is something he remembers." But that didn't make sense. Kael had never met Maya. Not to her knowledge, not in any documented operation. But what if... Her mind flickered back to what she'd read about trauma conditioning, memory imprinting, residual scent mapping, things even Kael's vet had warned her he might carry forever. What if what he recognized wasn't Maya herself, but what had been done to her? Nora picked up the photo again, held it higher. Kael growled once more, low, vibrating in his throat like an old war drum that hadn't been touched in years. She placed her hand on his back, his fur still rough in places from old burns. "I hear you," she whispered, and she meant it, not as a comfort, but as a vow. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't noise. This was Kael's alarm, the one thing stronger than trauma. The call to protect something innocent. And it had just been triggered. The precinct hadn't changed. Same scuffed tile floors, same coffee-stained counter in the front, same bulletin board filled with outdated memos and be-on-the-lookout posters that no one ever really looked at. But to Nora, it felt foreign now. She walked in slow, Kael beside her in his custom harness. His wheels rolled silently across the floor, the faint whir the only sound they made. Officers glanced up from their desks, some nodding out of reflex, others quickly returning to their screens. No one said much. Maybe it was the look on her face, or maybe it was the way Kael moved silent, steady, like a ghost returning to a battlefield. At the reception desk, Sergeant Lemkin looked up, surprised. "Nora? Thought you were on extended leave." "I was," she replied, dropping a thin manila folder onto the counter. "But I need someone to look at this. Now." He glanced down. "Missing persons? Maya Sandoval. Vanished from a trauma clinic 2 days ago. I've got reason to believe her disappearance isn't voluntary." Lemkin opened the file halfway, then leaned back with a dismissive sigh. "We already filed it. Teenager, history of anxiety. Probably took off after a bad session." Nora's jaw tightened. No note, no evidence she walked out, and no security footage. Conveniently, the feed cut out during the exact window she would have exited. "Glitch," he said, already half scrolling through his screen. "Tech said it happens. Besides, that place runs therapy for abuse victims. Emotions run high. Runaways happen more than you think." Her voice dropped. "Her mother was one of mine, Esperanza Sandoval. I pulled her out of a trafficking ring 8 years ago." That got a flicker of attention. Nora pressed forward. She was terrified something like this would happen, and now her daughter's gone, and you're writing it off like it's a tantrum? Lemkin held her gaze a beat longer, then shrugged. "Not my call. Higher up said to hold it at non-critical status for now." She stared at him. "Who made that call?" "Lieutenant Darrow. Same as always." Darrow, of course. The man had always been a politician wrapped in a badge, cared more about headlines than patterns, and if someone told him to keep something quiet, he'd bury it so deep it'd never breathe again. Nora leaned over the counter, voice low. "Something's wrong, and Kael knows it." As if on cue, Kael shifted beside her, ears twitching, gaze locked on the hallway beyond reception. Not agitated, but waiting, watching, like he knew something was about to come walking around the corner. Lemkin looked at the dog, then back at her. "He still have the instinct? He never lost it." "Well," Lemkin said, closing the folder and sliding it back toward her, "not sure what you want from me. The case is classified as a low priority. Unless evidence turns up, that's the rule." Nora didn't move. Her hand stayed on the folder, but her eyes burned into his. "I used to sit in this chair," she said softly. "Used to be the one who made noise when something didn't feel right. Remember what we always told the rookies?" Lemkin raised an eyebrow. "If your gut says someone's not safe, you don't wait for a report. You go." He didn't respond. Behind her, a door opened and shut, somewhere deeper in the precinct. A phone rang. Laughter came from one of the back offices, light, and careless. The building was moving on, but Nora couldn't, not with Kael sitting by the door still rigid, like a statue of what used to be. She picked up the folder. "Don't say I didn't bring it to you," she said quietly. As she turned to go, Lemkin called after her, "You're not on the force anymore, Nora. You dig too deep into this, you're on your own." She didn't turn back. Outside, the wind cut sharp against her face. Kael rolled beside her down the steps, paws silent on concrete. She knelt next to him once they reached the car. "You knew they'd brush it off, didn't you?" she asked, voice barely above a breath. Kael didn't move, but his eyes held something like a mirror, not reflection, recognition. She reached up and tapped his badge, the one he still wore on his harness, dull now with time. "Then we do it the old way," she said, "just you and me." And this time, they wouldn't wait for permission to save someone. The waiting room smelled like lemon disinfectant and faint regret. Nora sat stiff-backed in a vinyl chair that squeaked every time she shifted. Across from her, Kael rested on his support pad, gaze half-lidded but alert. His eyes tracked the receptionist with quiet precision. Every click of her pen, every shuffle of her mouse. He didn't trust this place. Neither did Nora. Jeremy Nevin wasn't new to her. She'd worked adjacent to him for years during high-risk trauma cases, both civilian and K. He wasn't warm, but he was competent, clinical, careful, the kind of man who triple-checked test results but never looked anyone in the eye for more than a few seconds. The receptionist tapped her headset. "He'll see you now. Room 4. Nora stood. Kael rolled forward beside her, his wheels whispering across the linoleum. Room 4 was at the end of a narrow hallway, quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lighting overhead. She knocked once before entering. Dr. Nevin looked up from his desk. Thinner than she remembered. Paler, too. His gray-blonde hair was receding, and a thin vein pulsed at his temple as if under constant pressure. "Nora," he said, standing but not offering a hand, "it's been a while." "It has," she replied, motioning toward Kael. "Thought it was time for a second opinion." Nevin's eyes dropped to the dog lingering on the harness. He didn't smile. "I heard about the raid," he said flatly, "and about the injury. I'm sorry." Nora sat across from him. "He's stable, but there's been some recent behavioral spikes, not random, focused." Nevin tapped a pen against his notepad. "Flashbacks?" "No, triggered by a case." Nevin didn't respond, just waited. Nora pulled Maya's photo from her coat pocket and slid it across the desk. Nevin glanced at it, then quickly looked away. Too quickly, Nora noticed. "He growled when he saw her face," she said. "Not fear, not aggression, protection, recognition." Nevin rubbed at his jaw. Dogs can imprint on expressions, facial features. Could be a false flag. "She's missing," Nora added, watching him closely. "Vanished after a session at Mindbridge, and he—" She nodded toward Kael. "He's not reacting to the girl. He's reacting to what's behind her." Nevin didn't answer, so she leaned in. "Does the name Seren X mean anything to you?" His pen dropped, a soft clatter, but it might as well have been a gunshot. Nevin froze. His face paled further. The hand that reached down to retrieve the pen trembled slightly. Nora didn't blink. "You flinched." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, voice clipped. You do. I've never been affiliated with... I didn't say you were affiliated, she cut in. Just that you knew it. He stood abruptly. I think we're done here. Why? Because I have patients waiting. No one else is in the hallway. His nostrils flared. I'm not authorized to discuss classified trials, he snapped. There it was, the crack. Nora rose slowly, but her voice remained level. You know what they were doing, don't you? Behavior manipulation, hormonal overrides. You knew. Nevin moved to the door. I'm sorry, I can't. Was Kael part of it? That stopped him cold. He didn't turn, but his voice dropped to a whisper. You should walk away from this, Nora. Her breath caught. You're afraid. Nevin opened the door. Get out while you still can. Kael stood beside her now, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Nevin like he was trying to hear something unspoken behind the man's fear. Nora held Nevin's stare one last moment, then stepped out. Back in the hallway, the buzz of the overhead lights felt louder, colder. She waited until they were outside, until the front door shut behind them, before she exhaled. Kael looked up at her. I saw it too, she said quietly. He knew. And somewhere deep in the fog of her memory, a file name surfaced, faint, blurred, but real. Serene X. She'd seen it once, buried in a medical annex no one was supposed to read. A side project listed under Behavioral Conditioning, Phase 2. Back then she hadn't connected the dots, but Kael had lived them. And now the dots were drawing themselves. The attic was never meant to be used again. Boxes lined the low wooden beams like forgotten graves, each one taped shut with labels that had yellowed and curled over time. Case 118, Moreno. K9 Apia, June 09. Trafficking ring, northeast route. Nora stood in the center of the room, flashlight in one hand, sweat beginning to bead at her brow. Dust clung to everything. The air tasted like insulation and years of silence. Kael waited at the base of the attic steps. He couldn't climb any more, but he watched the shadows like a sentinel, alert as ever. She dug carefully, methodically, kneeling beside a box marked Closed Class B, Psychological Cases Retired. The tape peeled back with a tired sigh. Inside, stacks of old folders, some brittle with time, others warped from moisture. She began to scan, one file after another, names she hadn't said aloud in years. Victims, perpetrators, cases half solved or worse buried, and then her fingers froze on a sheet stamped in red. Confidential, interagency, shared intel only. Case Ref AE 4109 X. Subject Behavioral Reinforcement Trials. Non-consensual. Affiliated entity. Serene X Biomedical Initiative. Nora's breath left her chest. She sat back on her heels. The flashlight trembled slightly in her grip. Serene X, not just a whisper from a doctor's lips. Not just a name Kael had reacted to like a wound being touched. A real project. A real organization. Real victims. She flipped through the document, hand shaking. Most of it was redacted whole paragraphs, blotted in thick black ink. But enough remained. Subjects were conditioned using hormonal stimuli to alter fear response and loyalty anchors. Both canine and juvenile human trials conducted in tandem to test imprinting crossover. Phase 2. terminated due to undisclosed ethical breaches. It felt like reading a crime scene where the blood had been cleaned, but not the smell. She kept going. There were field notes, excerpts from handlers, diagrams of brain scans labeled with subject IDs. She paused at one, K9041. Subject tag. Her pulse quickened. K. Her eyes darted across the line. Subject exhibited heightened empathy toward female juveniles post-conditioning. Stress levels spiked when exposed to distress stimuli in controlled environments. Subject attempted to intervene in 6 out of 6 scenarios. Kael. She didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to see her partner reduced to a number in someone's experiment, but the pieces were too precise. The initials, the response patterns, the protective instincts toward girls like Maya. They hadn't trained that into him. They had engineered it. Her stomach churned. She stood, grabbing the file, clutching it like a piece of her own spine had just splintered. Downstairs, Kael was still waiting. She descended the stairs slowly, as if her body had to match the weight of what her mind had just uncovered. Kael looked up when she appeared, ears forward, head tilted, not in confusion, but in that quiet way he used to check on her after missions, as if to ask, "Did we make it out this time?" She knelt beside him, opened the folders again, and placed one trembling finger on the name, Serene X. Kael's gaze dropped to the page, and then he looked away. Not a flinch, a refusal. Like even now, he didn't want her to see what it made him feel. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered. Not to the file, to him, because she had been his handler, his protector, and somewhere along the way, while she'd trusted the system had used him. She reached for his harness, ran her hand along the edge where the fabric met the scar behind his right ear, the one the vet had never fully explained. Now she knew. It wasn't just trauma. It was memory, deliberate, engineered, and weaponized. She leaned her forehead gently against his. "We're not done yet." Kael didn't move, but his eyes met hers with something that shimmered, not anger, not fear, resolve. The clinic where Maya had last been seen was nestled on a side street most people wouldn't find unless they were lost or looking to disappear. It looked harmless glass doors, ivy-covered fence, a calming blue logo that promised wellness and recovery. Nora had walked past places like this before, places that smiled at you while hiding something feral underneath. The receptionist at Mindbridge had given her the usual lines. She left calmly. "Security footage malfunctioned. We're cooperating fully with local law enforcement." She didn't bother showing her badge, didn't have one anymore. She had something better, Kael. They moved through the side entrance, Nora's hand brushing the same path. Maya's likely took steel handle, scuffed tile, the faint scent of eucalyptus cleaner, just strong enough to hide something more clinical. Something too clean. The air was still, heavy. Kael moved with quiet purpose. No barking, no tail wagging, just precision. His nose sweeping low, ears twitching in minute angles. He paused at the base of the main hallway, nostrils flaring. Nora watched him closely. He veered off without cue, toward a patient room near the back. The lights overhead flickered slightly as she followed. The room was small bed neatly made, therapy chair in the corner, a faint impression left in the seat cushion like someone had sat there long, too long, maybe shaken the whole time. Kael didn't care about the furniture. He headed to the wall vent beneath the window. Then he froze. A soft sound escaped him. Not a growl. A low, guttural rumble deep in his chest, like the past was vibrating through him. Then he started to scratch. Not frantic, but focused, the way he had once dug through rubble for a missing girl in a collapsed building in Anchorage. His back legs may no longer carry him at full sprint, but his front paws, still strong, still relentless, dug into the vent cover with mounting urgency. Clink, clink, clink. Nora stepped closer. "Kael, what is it?" He didn't stop, didn't look at her, just clawed again. Then he stopped, sat back, looked at her, the way he used to when he'd found a body, a bump, or something worse. Nora crouched and pulled a penlight from her coat. The vent was old, the screws half rusted. She took out her multi-tool and began unscrewing each one. As the cover gave way with a metallic creak, a rush of cold, stale air escaped like something exhaled for the first time in years. Inside the duct, wedged between a loose grate and the wall lining, was a small, clear object. A syringe, capped, but used. She froze. Her breath caught before her mind did. The label on the syringe was partially smeared, but one word remained legible. SRNX43B, Sarin X. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. The plastic was slightly sticky residue from latex gloves, maybe. Kael pressed closer to her leg, silent but alert, eyes trained on the tiny object as though it were alive. She looked at him. "You knew." His ears twitched. He didn't move, didn't need to, because this wasn't just scent anymore. This was memory. Kael had been in rooms like this before. Maybe not this exact one, but identical in essence. Sterile, cold, thick with the chemical silence of trauma. Whatever they'd done here, whatever they'd injected into Maya, his body remembered it. Not as a thought, as a scar. Nora swallowed. "Whoever did this," she murmured, "they were never planning to let her leave." She placed the syringe gently into a biohazard evidence pouch, sealed it, and tucked it into her coat. Outside, the clouds had thickened. Light dulled into that slate gray that comes just before rain. Nora stood slowly. Kael remained still, one paw pressed lightly against the now open vent, as if marking the place like a grave. She reached down and stroked the back of his neck. His fur was damp with sweat, hers or his. She didn't know anymore. "We're close," she whispered. He looked up, and in his eyes, for the briefest second, she saw something terrifyingly human. Resolve wrapped in grief. Memory sharpened by instinct. A dog who had smelled this nightmare before and who had already decided he wouldn't let it happen again. The girl had no name, no wallet, no phone, no shoes, just dirt under her fingernails, a cracked wristband that read "Sinkin," and eyes that didn't blink unless the light changed. They'd found her at the edge of a fallow field, barefoot and bloodless, but alive. Whoever called it in said she looked hollowed out, as if someone had erased the person but left the shape behind. Now, she lay in a pale green hospital bed, the kind with side rails designed for safety, but that always felt like soft restraints. An IV drip ticked quietly beside her, feeding her saline, maybe something for the tremors. Her arms were thin. She hadn't spoken a single word since they brought her in, Nora stood in the doorway, still. Kael sat beside her, unmoving, head low, eyes fixed on the girl, like he knew better than to look away. The nurse nodded once and stepped back, leaving them alone. Nora entered gently. Her boots made no sound on the linoleum. The girl's gaze didn't move, not to the door, not to Nora's face. It stayed fixed on something that wasn't there anymore, something behind glass, something that wouldn't let go. Nora pulled a chair beside the bed, sat, no questions, no clipboard, just presence. Kael, as if understanding the rules better than any human, moved with slow, reverent grace and curled up beside the girl's bed. Not touching her, not nosing or whining, just being there, stillness as offering. And for the first time in an hour, the girl blinked. Just once. Nora caught it. A flicker of awareness, barely noticeable, but real. "She doesn't have a name," the nurse had said earlier. "No match in the system. She's Jane Doe Sit until further notice. 17. Nora didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She leaned forward, her voice soft as thread. "I'm not here to ask you to talk. I'm here to tell you that someone is listening, even if it's not with ears." She glanced at Kael. His head had lowered to his paws, but he was awake, always awake. "They thought he wouldn't remember either," Nora added. "But he did. He still does." The girl didn't move, but her fingers twitched. Nora saw it. A subtle tremor through the tendons. She opened her jacket slowly, pulling out the photo of Maya. Not showing it, just holding it between two fingers near her lap, a test, a whisper of a possibility. The girl didn't flinch, didn't reach, but her lips parted. Dry, unused, then closed again. Kael's ear twitched, and then, like a crack in the concrete, a whisper, not a word, just a sound. Air moving through vocal cords, but it was enough to make Kael lift his head. He didn't move closer, just looked up at her gently, like he was asking for permission. The girl's hand moved, slowly with effort, resting near the edge of the bed, not toward Nora, toward Kael, and he answered by sliding forward an inch, then another, until his chin rested just near her wrist. Not touching, but there, and the girl exhaled. Not relief, not trust, just breath, like she had remembered how. Nora leaned in slightly. "You don't have to speak, but if there's something left inside you, even a name, even a shape, he'll stay until you're ready." No response. But a tear slid down the girl's temple and into the hospital pillow. Kael didn't move, didn't blink, because he understood something the room could not. This wasn't about words. It was about space, about being seen even when you can't look back. Nora stayed until the light shifted on the wall, until shift change buzzed through the hallway. Before she left, she placed the photo of Maya on the side table, not as evidence, as reminder. Then she bent down beside Kael, brushing a hand over his fur. "She's seen something," she whispered. "Same as you." Kael didn't respond, but his tail thumped once, soft, almost sad, almost like a memory. The next morning, the girl was still staring at the ceiling, not asleep, not quite awake. Somewhere in between, like her mind hadn't fully come back from wherever they'd taken her. Nora entered quietly, carrying no badge, no clipboard, just Kael. He moved slower today, the pain in his hips visible with each careful step. But when they reached the side of the bed, he laid down with the same quiet dignity he always carried, a living anchor. Nora sat beside the girl again. The silence stretched between them like a thread pulled taut. Then the girl's lips moved, no voice, just a shape of sound without sound. Nora leaned closer. "What did you say?" The girl blinked, her pupils dilated, but locked onto some point beyond the wall. Then again, lips parting, slowly. "Noise," Nora frowned. Kael's ears twitched. "Noise?" she repeated softly. The girl's mouth moved again. "Chair." Her voice cracked like frost under weight thin and breaking. Nora pulled a notepad from her coat and scribbled the 2 words down. Noise, chair. Then came the third one. The one that made Kael sit up, spine stiff, nose suddenly raised in the air like scent had entered the room. "Ah, room 13. Not a sentence, not a story, but fragments, pieces. Still, they sliced clean through the quiet. Nora's breath caught in her throat. "Room 13, she whispered. "Where?" The girl didn't answer, but her hands had balled into fists, gripping the blanket tight, knuckles white, with a tension far older than this moment. Kael moved forward, gently pressing his chin onto her forearm. She didn't flinch this time, didn't move away, just stilled. And in that stillness, something else shifted. Nora took a long breath and rose, moving to the window. The morning outside was gray, overcast, like the world was holding its breath. Noise, chair, room 13. To anyone else, the words meant nothing. But Nora had seen this before in survivors, in trafficking cases, in former operatives broken by deep conditioning tactics. Repetition, association, keywords tied to physical triggers. This wasn't just memory, it was programming. Someone had trained this girl to respond, maybe even not respond, until those very patterns were activated. And now, she was short-circuiting her own silence. Nora turned back. "Did you hear the noise before the chair or after?" The girl blinked. Tears welled in the corners of her eyes, unblinking. One slid across her temple. Then her lips parted again. "Noise? Was it loud? High?" Nora's pen flew across the notepad. "Like a tone? A beep?" The girl gave no answer, but her hands flinched again. Kael let out a soft huff, pressing closer. Then the girl whispered one more thing, this time with voice faint, cracked, but there, 13, locked. Nora's spine straightened. Not just room 13, locked. Something was being hidden there, or someone. Kael rose to his feet slowly. His stance had changed. Not alert, like he was ready to fight, but protective. Like whatever the girl had just recalled had scraped against something buried deep inside him, too. He stood between Nora and the girl now, eyes on the door. Nora took one more note, then tucked the paper into her jacket. She turned to the girl. "I'll find it." For the first time, the girl's eyes met hers, flickered. Not trust, but something just as important, recognition. And Kael thumped his tail once against the floor, just once, not happy, but ready. Because some memories break people, and some break the ones who cause them. The file was buried, not metaphorically, literally. A folded manila envelope taped to the underside of a drawer in Nora's old storage locker, wrapped in layers of dust and age-stiffened plastic. It shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have survived. But some things cling to the shadows until they're needed again. Nora spread the contents out on her kitchen table: ownership records, inspection logs, tax filings that had conveniently stopped just a year before Serenex was officially shut down. The paperwork was meticulous, too clean. But one property stood out: latitude, longitude, no name, just grid coordinates, nestled deep within the Pine Hollow Basin, remote, cold, forgotten. She recognized the forest terrain instantly. She'd patrolled there once in a joint training exercise years ago. Abandoned cabins, no signal, winding roads that didn't exist on public maps. And one structure, if she remembered correctly, had been sealed even back then. A structure with no listed owner. Until now. She tapped her pen against the printed coordinates. Kael lay nearby, half drowsing, but his ears lifted with every sound. She whispered, "Kael." He looked up, groggy, but alert. Then she did something she hadn't done since they left the force. She slid the map across the floor toward him. "Do you know this place?" His reaction was instant. Not aggression, not warning, but something worse. He froze, then slowly backed away. His tail curled inward, and then he shook, not from pain, from fear. Nora's breath hitched. It was the first time in all the years she'd known him that she had ever seen Kael shiver. Not in combat, not in explosions, not even when he'd taken shrapnel to the spine. But now, staring at a satellite image of a forest, he was trembling. She knelt beside him, placing a steady hand against his shoulder. "Talk to me," she murmured. He whimpered low and guttural, the sound of something remembered, not imagined. She stared down at the map again. The coordinates matched the old cabin site, but there was more. A subterranean wing had been added years ago, cloaked beneath geothermal research permits. No one had ever followed up on them. No one had cared to. She scanned the inspection notes. Most were blank, but one contained a single word, scribbled in faded ink in the margins of a report: cage, and then beside it a three-letter code: K9. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Kael turned away, curling in on himself. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Nora sat in the silence, heart heavy. Something had happened there, not just to Maya, not just to that Jane Doe girl with the hollow stare, but to Kael. Something that even now his body remembered better than his mind could. Because dogs don't forget scent, don't forget sound, and they never forget pain when it comes without reason. She gently reached for his face, guiding his gaze back to her. "I need to go," she whispered. "You don't have to come." But Kael, eyes glassy with memory, forced himself upright, wobbled slightly, and stood, not defiant, not brave, just willing. Because somewhere beneath that cage in the woods was a truth they had buried not just in files, but in flesh, Kael's. The message came just after 3 p.m., when the sun slanted low enough through the blinds to make the shadows look longer than they should have been. Nora was sifting through old photos, trying to match faces from the Serenex archive to any missing persons bulletins. Kael lay by the back door, half asleep but never fully gone, his ears tilting toward every click of the mouse. Her phone buzzed. Voicemail, one new message. She barely looked at it. Probably spam. Maybe her landlord again about the security lights. But something in her gut tightened. She tapped to play it. And the voice that came through was male. Calm, dry, like it had been pre-recorded through teeth that didn't know guilt. You don't stop digging, we bury more. One bark at a time. Click. No background noise, no traceable caller ID, just words that settled into her rib cage like lead. Kael stood up, not suddenly, not with growls, but slowly, deliberately. He patted over and placed his nose against the phone, still resting in her hand, like he could smell the intent behind it. Nora stared down at him. Her voice was quiet. You heard it too? Kael's tail didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. There was no need to answer. That night, the wind changed. It howled sharper, like it had claws. Nora sat by the kitchen window, staring out at nothing. The voicemail still played in the back of her mind on a loop, as if some part of her brain was waiting to decode a deeper threat buried beneath the syllables. Kael hadn't eaten. He lay near the door, rigid and listening, and then at 2:12 a.m., the house went dark, all of it. Not a fuse, not a neighborhood outage, just her. Everything shut down like a switch had been thrown. The hum of the fridge died. The digital clock blinked out. Even the street lamp outside her driveway went dead. Nora didn't move, didn't panic. She waited. And in that silence, she heard it. A faint tick at the window, barely audible, like someone testing the glass with a fingernail. Kael bolted upright, a low, visceral growl erupting from deep in his chest. It wasn't his usual bark. This one was personal. Warning turned to promise. Nora rose from the chair, hand sliding instinctively to the holster, still looped to the side of her coat rack. Not because she wanted to shoot, but because the air told her something wasn't right. She moved to the hallway light switch, flicked it, nothing. Kael had crossed the room already, now braced near the far window that overlooked the backyard. She followed, and there, through the slits of the blinds, she saw it. A shadow. Tall, still, too still. Not a drunk neighbor, not a teenager with bad timing. Someone watching, waiting. She dropped to a crouch beside Kael, whispered, "What do you smell?" He didn't answer with movement, but his body had tensed, nostrils flaring, breathing low. Then, almost inaudibly, he huffed twice. The signal they'd trained for years ago, armed and close. Nora's pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't intimidation. It was reconnaissance. Someone had cut her power, silenced her street lamp, and was now testing her windows like they had all the time in the world. She inched back toward the hallway, reaching for her emergency battery lantern and slipping her phone into her pocket. It was already useless. No signal. No power meant no Wi-Fi router. They'd thought of everything, but they hadn't thought about Kael, and they hadn't thought about her. She returned to the window and flicked the blinds just slightly enough to catch a glimpse of a jacket. Black. No logos, but on the shoulder, a patch. A single emblem, Sarin X. Her breath hitched. It was real. The threat, the network, the reach. They hadn't just watched her. They were acting now. Kael growled again. stepping sideways until he was between her and the glass, still trembling from the trauma of that facility, still walking with the limp of fused nerves and forgotten pain, but standing and daring the night to move first. Nora whispered low, "I hear you. I'm not backing down." She stayed there for 10 more minutes, eyes locked on the dark, until the shape was gone and the lights blinked back on one by one like nothing had happened. But she knew better. So did Kael, because the war they were walking into didn't begin with a raid or a file. It began with a question. Who do you protect when the people who trained you become the threat? The knock didn't come. Neither did the crash. No shattered windows, no kicked-in doors, just the sound of air changing. Nora had learned to read silence like language, and something about this one wasn't natural. It had weight. It was hiding something. She was halfway to the back hallway when Kael growled, not the deep bark of a territorial dog, but the short, choking snarl of, "You are not supposed to be here." She pivoted, hand sliding to the small of her back, feeling for the cold weight of her backup Glock. Her breath slowed, muscles coiled, then came the click. Floorboard, second hallway. Inside, Kael was already moving, dragging his hind legs with urgent effort, his claws scraping against the wood floor like teeth against bone. He ignored the pain. There was no time for pain. Nora flicked the hall light on, still working. Power was back. Good, bad. Because that meant someone had planned around it. She stepped into the narrow hallway and saw the shape, black hoodie, gloved hands, a small crowbar tucked at his hip. He froze just a second too late. Their eyes met, and Kael launched. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast, but it was final. He hurled his weight into the man's legs, snarling through his teeth, dragging the full weight of his front body down. The man hit the ground hard. One hand flailed for the crowbar. Nora shouted, "Kael, hold!" Kael's jaws snapped centimeters from the man's throat, but he obeyed. Not because of command, because she had said it. The man tried to twist free, kicking at Kael's ribs. The dog didn't move, didn't yelp, didn't break. Nora moved like she was back on the force, swept the crowbar away, pinned the wrist, drove her knee into his shoulder. One sharp crack of flesh meeting wall. The man gasped. "Who sent you?" she hissed. He said nothing, but his hoodie pulled back enough for something to slide out from his inner coat pocket, a patch, woven black thread on gray backing, Seren X. Not faded, new, freshly printed. Recently issued. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't someone digging through old files. This was current operations. She pressed the barrel of the Glock to his collarbone. "You're going to tell me everything, or I'll let him finish what you started." Kael didn't move, didn't growl. He just stared into the man, and the man finally shook. Not because of the gun, because of the dog. Nora could see it in his eyes, the realization this wasn't some mutt. This was something trained, something wronged, and something he couldn't predict. The man spat blood to the side. "You don't get it," he hissed. "You're already too late." Nora's grip didn't falter. "Too late for what?" "They're not in hiding anymore. They're testing." A beat of silence. Kael's breathing slowed. Steady now. Nora pulled a zip tie from her drawer, bound the man's hands behind his back, and dragged him toward the kitchen. Her hands didn't tremble, but her soul did, because the lie was over. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't trauma making her see things. Serenex was operational, and they had just sent a message. She turned back to Kael, who was standing on 3 legs, chest heaving. "You held your ground," she whispered. He blinked slowly, then limped to her side, like nothing in the world could pull him away again. And Nora, despite the adrenaline, felt one thing more than fear: conviction. They weren't running anymore. They were going to end this. Together. They met at the old train yard, abandoned since the late 90s, a place that reeked of rust, diesel, and the ghosts of conversations no one wanted recorded. Nora waited by track 3, her breath visible in the night air. Kael sat at her feet, ears tilted forward, eyes never leaving the shadows. She didn't call first, didn't confirm. If Caleb Hart said he'd come, he would. And just before the hour struck midnight, he did. No badge, no uniform, just a man in a civilian coat, too old for denial and too tired to pretend he hadn't once worn the same truths she now carried like scars. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, eyes flicking to Kael with recognition. "I could say the same to you," she replied. He hesitated, then reached into his coat and handed her a folder wrapped in what looked like wax paper. "You didn't get this from me. It doesn't exist. It never did." She took it, felt the stiffness of fire-damaged paper inside. Kael sniffed the folder and immediately went still. Hart stepped back, like even proximity to the file felt dangerous. They tried to burn it, classified shredders, fire-safe incinerator, but someone pulled it mid-process. Probably had a conscience. Nora opened it slowly. The first few pages were nearly unreadable singed edges, blotted ink, half-melted seals. But as she flipped further, the document sharpened. Stark black redactions cut across entire paragraphs, but some words survived. Phase 2, neural coercion. Subject, non-compliant. Canine stimulus initiated. Her stomach turned. She read further. Subject 47, female, 13. Response to exposure. Elevated cortisol. Submissive posture within 17 minutes. Stimulus, K07. Activated under sedation. Then reintroduced post-trauma imprinting. Behavior modification successful after 3 exposures. She swallowed hard. Kael was staring at her, not confused, not afraid, but watching her read like he already knew. She turned the page, more redactions. Then one photo faded, smudged with soot, but unmistakable. A girl slumped in a chair, face blank, IV taped to her arm, and behind her, caged in a glass room, a German shepherd. Not Kael, but the harness read K. Yeah, my A11. Compliant stimulators, Hart said under his breath. That's what they called them. Dogs trained not just to sniff drugs or detain suspects, but to alter human behavior, create associations, train obedience through fear, scent, even silence. Nora's voice broke the air like a match strike. This wasn't law enforcement. No, Hart agreed. This was conditioning. Psychology weaponized through trust. She felt the bile rise in her throat. Kael whined softly, inching closer. "What do they want with Maya?" she asked. Hart didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice cracked. "They're not stopping, Nora. They've moved past experiments. They're applying." She closed the folder, burned edges, redacted truth, and one undeniable fact in bold ink: that no one had been able to erase. Sirenex, Behavioral Systems Division, active deployment recommended. The air around them stilled. A train screeched faintly in the far distance, like metal wailing in protest. Nora looked up at Hart. "Why give this to me?" He didn't blink. "Because you're the only one with a partner who remembers what they did, and the courage to make sure the world does too." She said nothing, just turned toward the dark and walked away. Kael limped at her side, his body tired, but his eyes steady. The file tucked beneath her coat burned against her ribs, not from heat, but from truth. The coffee shop was the kind of place that didn't belong on a map. Tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a pawn shop with bars on the windows. No music, no Wi-Fi, just the low hiss of an espresso machine and the dull clink of ceramic against wood. Nora sat in the back corner, her jacket zipped high, despite the warmth. Kael lay at her feet, motionless, except for the slight flick of one ear. His eyes scanned every movement, every whisper. She had memorized the photo twice before coming Elsie Grant. Former trauma nurse, once contracted by Sarin under the guise of behavioral pharmacology support. She had gone silent after 2018, off-grid, until last week. Now, she was 15 minutes late. Nora didn't fidget, didn't sip her coffee. She waited the way only someone with a badge in their bones could, patient, still, prepared to explode if needed. And then she appeared, mid-40s, hair dyed too red, a coat too large for her frame, but her eyes, those hadn't changed from the photo, wide, haunted. She hesitated near the counter. Her gaze flicked to Kael, and she froze, just for a heartbeat. Then she walked over, carefully, like stepping through broken glass. "Detective Vance?" Her voice cracked. "Just Nora now," she replied quietly. Elsie didn't sit right away. She looked down at Kael. He lifted his head, slow, deliberate, then stared. Elsie blinked fat. "I didn't think he'd still be alive," she whispered. Nora's blood chilled. "You recognize him. I wasn't sure when you called, but now, those eyes." Her voice thinned. "They called him Specimen Delta. In the logs, I called him Kael behind their backs. That was his real name, wasn't it?" Nora nodded slowly. "Tell me everything." Elsie finally sat, and she began. "They brought him in as part of a joint operation. Said he was military, retired early. But even then he was already trained, beyond anything I'd seen, smelled things no one else could. Reacted to distress before it became audible." She swallowed hard. Sirenex didn't want that. They wanted to change him, condition him. They needed him to pair scent with emotion, trauma with obedience. Not from him, but into others. Nora's breath stilled. "What kind of trauma?" Elsie didn't answer with words at first. She reached into her purse, pulled out an old USB logs, footage, some redacted, some not. Nora took it, eyes never leaving her. Elsie's voice dropped to almost nothing. They'd put him in rooms with children separated by glass, made him listen to screams, trained him to lie still through it, to stay obedient while others broke. He never attacked, never looked away, but every time he got quieter, until he wouldn't even drink water, unless commanded. Nora's hands tightened around the USB Kael was sitting up now, watching Elsie. His head tilted just slightly, like he remembered the scent of her voice. "I tried to report it," Elsie said, almost pleading, "but the program was buried under national security tags. The higher-ups said it was behavioral resilience modeling, which said these dogs would make the next generation of trauma responders immune to horror." Nora's voice came low, sharp. "But Kael didn't become immune. He became haunted." Elsie nodded. Tears welled. "I left when they started phase 3, when they said the dogs wouldn't just observe trauma, they'd enforce it." She reached into her coat again and slid a faded ID badge across the table. Her own, with the CERTX insignia still burned into the corner. "I should have done more," she whispered. Kael let out a sound then, not a growl, not a whimper, but a breath, like he finally recognized someone from the fire. Elsie broke. "I used to sneak him peanut butter," she sobbed, covering her mouth. "They said dogs shouldn't get treats outside schedule, but I couldn't stand the way he looked at that glass." Nora didn't say anything. She reached down, placed a hand gently on Kael's shoulder. "I need your help," she said to Elsie. "They're still operating. They took a girl. Kael's been leading me back to them." Elsie blinked through the tears. "He remembers?" "Yes." "And you're willing to follow that memory?" Nora met her eyes, steady. "Certain. I don't care how far it goes. He jumped into fire to save me. I owe him the same." Elsie nodded slowly, then handed over one last thing, a laminated floor map, yellowed at the corners. "Start here," she said. "Room 4C. That's where they tested memory thresholds." Nora looked down at the map, then back at Kael. "Let's go find what they hoped you'd forget." And Kael wagged his tail just once. The rain had softened into mist by the time they returned. Nora didn't turn on the lights. She moved by memory now, routine carved into muscle from weeks of wounds that never bruised on the skin. Kael followed, slow and silent, his paws barely making a sound on the wooden floor. His limp had worsened after the trip. She noticed. He didn't complain. He never did. She laid out a towel and eased his body onto it. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that made your thoughts sound too loud. Nora knelt beside him, a bowl of warm water in one hand, a cloth in the other. It had become their nightly ritual. Clean his paws, check the joints, massage around the scar tissue. She spoke little, only when necessary. Kael didn't need words. He read her breath, her posture, her pauses. Tonight felt different. He wasn't relaxing. His eyes stayed locked on the far wall, pupils wide, jaw set. It was like he was trying to disappear into the floor. She dipped the cloth and pressed gently around his neck, brushing past the collarbone, the ribs. Then she moved behind the ear. That's when he flinched, not sharply, but enough. Like he'd heard a noise that wasn't there. Nora froze. She shifted the fur aside, parting it with her fingers. There, just under the edge of the skin, where no fur grew cleanly, was a scar. No, not a scar. A burn, deliberate, thin, circular. Her breath hitched. "Kael," she whispered. He didn't look at her, didn't move. But she could feel it, the way his muscles tensed under her hand, the way his chest stopped rising for a beat too long. She leaned closer, inspecting the mark. It wasn't from combat. It was surgical, not fresh, but neither forgotten. And just beneath it, a faint bump. A micro-implant site? No, removed long ago, But once embedded, the words from the file came back like static. Stimulus, delivery point, oral, proximity, preferred for neural response. And something else. Something Elsie had said. They'd force him to stay, to watch, so that his body associated obedience with suffering. Her stomach turned. She looked into Kael's eyes, glassy, distant, not fear of pain, fear of memory. This was what they did to him. They trained him not just to obey commands, but to feel guilt when others were hurt. They wired his empathy, weaponized his instincts, forced him to witness acts of horror while restrained, then praised him when he didn't bark. Tears welled behind her eyes. "You weren't broken," she whispered. "They made you carry it." Kael turned his head toward her slowly. His eyes finally met hers, and in that stare, silent and heavy, she saw it all. The girl in the glass room, the screams, the handler's cold voice, the sharp click of a remote just before a shock. And Kael curled in the corner of his crate, shaking not because he was weak, but because he understood. They had conditioned him to feel the pain of others more deeply than his own. That was his punishment and his gift. She sat down fully now, legs crossed, her hands still cupping the back of his neck. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out hollow, inadequate. But Kael moved forward an inch, pressed his muzzle into her palm, and exhaled. A sound not of comfort, but of release. She reached for a blanket and wrapped it around his frame. They stayed like that for a long time, woman and dog, silence and memory, guilt and grace. And when the wind rattled the windows again, Nora finally spoke. "They tried to make you forget who you were." She brushed his ear with her thumb. "But they didn't erase you. You're still here, with me." Kael's tail moved slightly. Just once, not joy, not relief, but something quieter, a memory reclaimed, and a promise unspoken, but felt deep in the chest. He would see this through, not because someone ordered him to, but because now he remembered why it mattered. The box didn't look like much. It was a plain archive container, edges frayed, corners taped more than once. No label, no markings, just the weight of something too long buried, now demanding to be seen. Elsie slid it across the diner table without a word. Nora stared at it. The ticking of the wall clock sounded louder in its presence. Kael sat beside her bench seat, unmoving. His ears twitched every so often, like he was sensing memory leaking from the cardboard itself. "This is everything I saved before I ran," Elsie whispered. Her hands trembled as she pulled her coat tighter. "They burned the rest, but I made copies of the worst." Nora ran her fingers over the lid. She didn't ask if Elsie was sure. Some things didn't need permission. She lifted the top. Inside, a stack of file folders bound by twine, a few faded photographs without sleeves, a plastic zip bag of memory cards, and a folded blueprint with the ink half faded from water damage. The first file had no name, just a code, INT Honterie. She opened it. Photos, intake forms, scans of psyche assessments filled out with clinical detachment, all for a girl 7 years old, large eyes half smiling, like she'd been asked to but didn't understand why. Nora turned the page, then froze. The same girl, older now, Maya. Hair a little longer, face more solemn, but unmistakable. This was Maya 3 years ago. Nora's heart stuttered. Kael let out a soft sound, like a breath catching in his throat. There were notes on the margins in red ink. Subject demonstrates rare empathy mirroring when exposed to shared trauma stimuli. Behavioral drift noted possible candidate for Phase 3. She flipped to the back of the photo. Someone had scrawled a line in slanted handwriting. Phase 3, cognitive inversion, begins tentile. Nora stared at the date. That was 6 days from now. She swallowed hard. What is Phase 3? She asked, voice low. Elsie shook her head, eyes hollow. I don't know all the layers, but the last meeting I heard before I left, they talked about turning memory into obedience, about implanting false associations between fear and comfort, about rewiring identity itself. She paused. Not just conditioning responses, replacing them. Nora's knuckles whitened as she held the photo tighter. They're not just erasing who these kids are, she said. They're rewriting them. She reached for the blueprint. It unfolded with a quiet crackle. A facility, layout, several underground wings, numbered not in order, but in fragments. 3B, 7F, 4C. One of them circled in ink. East wing sublevel. Kael moved. He stood and nosed the blueprint right at the circle, then looked up at Nora. A signal. She met his eyes. She understood. That's where she is, she murmured. Elsie's voice barely held steady. If she's still alive, she'll be in that wing. Nora replaced the lid and secured the twine. Her hands weren't shaking, not anymore. She looked to Kael, his gaze now firm, no flinch, no hesitation. The scar behind his ear still visible, but no longer a symbol of what was done to him. Now it was a reminder of what he'd survived and what he refused to let happen again. We have 6 days, Nora said. Then we end this. Kael's tail tapped once against the floor. They both knew. This wasn't just rescue. It was reclamation of memory, of innocence, of truth the world refused to look at. And neither of them would stop until Maya was free. The call went out at midnight. Not a group text, not a chain email. Nora knew better. She used burner phones, one for each name old contacts, tied not by loyalty to the department anymore, but to her. To the things they'd seen, the things they could never unsee. Out of 5 calls, only 1 picked up, and only 1 said yes. His name was Miles Thatcher. Once the department's golden boy in cyber forensics, now a reclusive tech contractor who spent more time under false IPs than sunlight, the kind of man who could write a script to crash a security grid from a coffee shop bathroom, and had more than once. She met him in the back of a hardware store 2 towns over. I thought you were dead, he said casually, flipping his hood down. His hair had grown out, a mess of curls pressed flat by too many nights sleeping upright. Almost, Nora replied, stepping into the glow of an overhead bulb. But Kael dragged me out. Miles looked down. Kael was there, eyes locked on the man's face. Not a growl, just the kind of stare that made you sit straighter without knowing why. Miles whistled low. He looks like he's seen ghosts. He remembers too much. Yeah, Miles muttered. Don't we all? They got to work fast. Nora laid out the blueprint Elsie had given her. Kael sat beside it again, his nose resting just over the east wing, marking like he wouldn't let her forget. Miles tapped the schematic. That's old military grid wiring, meaning they've likely got layered jamming fields, won't be able to transmit out from the inside. I don't need to transmit, I need to record. He glanced at her. She met his gaze head on. They're rewriting kids' minds, Miles. They're using trauma like a switch. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't need to. Miles had seen enough in his time to know when someone was lying. And Nora Vance didn't lie. Not when it mattered. All right, he said. I'll rig you 2 setups. One for you. You body cam, low profile, hardwired. Second one for the dog. Kael lifted his head slightly at that. Miles raised an eyebrow. Does he bite? Only when he needs to. Fair enough. In less than 2 hours, he had it sketched. A micro-gimbal camera fitted to Kael's harness strap, curved flush with his frame to avoid catching on corners, heat-resistant, motion-triggered, infrared ready. And here, Miles added, is your silent friend. He slid a palm-sized device across the counter. Nora picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Signal jammer, he said. 10-minute burst field. Jam cameras, audio, GPS, Bluetooth, even cell. You flip the switch, and everything in 50 feet goes blind. Nora stared at it. How long did it take you to build this? Miles shrugged. 2 years of burnout, and 1 very boring month in Boise. She almost smiled, almost. Then her face hardened again. This isn't just recon anymore, Miles. I'm not just looking for Maya. There are others. I don't know how many. You going in alone? Nora hesitated, then looked down at Kael. No. There was silence, not tense, not awkward, just a shared weight between people who'd walked through fire and still smelled the smoke on each other. Miles exhaled. You'll need eyes on the perimeter. I can remote tap the outer cam loops. Maybe give you a window. But once you're inside, I won't be able to reach you. I know. He looked at her a long moment, then slid a folded patch across the table. Black thread, a simple emblem, a shepherd in shadow guarding a flame. It was Kael's old unit insignia. He said, you might want him to wear it. Nora took it with both hands, soft, frayed at the edge, worn like it had seen too much. She turned to Kael, who hadn't taken his eyes off the map. We go in 4 days, she said. Kael stood, slow but sure. Miles pulled his hoodie back up, then got help whoever's inside. Nora nodded once, pocketed the patch, and turned toward the door. Kael followed, quiet as breath. And somewhere behind them, the lights in the hardware store flickered once, then went out. The trees gave way to metal, a clearing carved into the forest like a wound raw, silent, unnatural. The facility sat sunken beneath a camouflaged bunker shell, concrete flaked with moss and time. From above, it looked abandoned, but Nora knew better. Entry point, sub-level air vent, Miles had said. South wing, time it between patrol loops. You'll get maybe 12 minutes inside before someone knows you're there. 12 minutes. 12 minutes to rip the truth out from underneath a nightmare. She crouched beside Kael, adjusting the body rig camera on his harness, fingers tightening each strap with silent precision. You ready? She whispered. Kael didn't move. He just looked up at her eyes, glassed with memory, legs stiff with the tension. The trembling in his muscles wasn't weakness. It was knowing. Every step forward was toward the place that had broken him, and still he stepped. They moved under the fence like ghosts. Inside, the world shifted. Cold fluorescent lights flickered in long, sterile corridors. The air tasted of ammonia and rust. Somewhere distant, a ventilation hum buzzed like a nervous tick. The building breathed like it remembered what it was. Kael's paws were near silent on the linoleum floor. But Nora could feel each footfall in her bones, not just because of the tension, but because she kept waiting for someone, for something, for a voice behind a door to shout, "Stop!" But nothing came. That was worse. Silence wasn't safety here. It was design. The rooms they passed were empty, but wrong. One held only a chair bolted to the floor, a drain in the center stained red. Another was lined wall to wall with speakers silent now, but once screaming something no child should ever hear. Kael's breathing thickened, not panicked, controlled. He knew how to survive here. That made it worse. Room 13 was at the end of the west hall, locked with a keypad already cracked open. A jar of needles lay tipped in the hallway. One snapped. Nora pushed the door slowly, gun raised, and froze. The bed was in the center of the room. Strapped to it, arms twitching, was a girl. Dark curls matted to her cheeks, mouth half open, pupils dilated like moons. Maya, still alive, but not whole. She didn't scream when she saw Nora. She didn't even flinch. Just blinked, slow, uncertain, like the world in front of her wasn't one she trusted anymore. "Maya," Nora breathed, lowering the weapon. Kael moved first, past Nora, past the bed, then stopped. He crouched beside her, nose barely touching the edge of the mattress, and for the first time, Maya moved. Not her arms, not her legs, her eyes. They followed Kael. Tears welled, but didn't fall, because some part of her remembered him, and some part of her still believed he had come back. Nora stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe now. We're getting you out of here." Maya didn't answer, but her lips parted like she might try. Kael let out a sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a breath. Nora reached for the restraints. They were magnetic, biometric, locked to a wristband worn by someone who hadn't bothered to take her pulse in hours. She didn't hesitate. She shot the locks off one by one. Maya flinched. But Kael didn't move. He just stayed with her, anchoring her to something real. As Nora pulled the last strap loose, Maya curled slowly onto her side like a broken thing, remembering how not to be broken. Footsteps echoed down the hall. They were no longer alone. Kael stood. This time there was no tremble, only resolve. Nora slung Maya into her arms lighter than she should be and nodded once toward the door. "Let's end this." Kael moved ahead, one step, then another, and the light down the hall began to die. The hallway erupted in red. Alarms shrieked to life like wounded machines, strobing lights pulsing against steel walls with violent urgency. Somewhere behind them, the heavy thud of boots echoed fast, trained, closing in. "Go, go!" Nora hissed, clutching Maya tighter. Kael was already moving, not away from the noise, toward it. They reached the corridor. Split left led to the sub-level fire exit Miles had mapped out. Right, toward the sound of incoming guards. Kael turned right. Nora stopped. Kael Nuto! But he didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Maya, blocking the path with his body. The dim red pulses made his shadow stretch wide against the walls. He looked larger than life, despite the drag in his back legs, despite the lingering tremor in his stance. This wasn't instinct. It was choice. He knew. There was no going back. Nora's grip on Maya tightened. The girl's breath came in short, frightened gasps, head buried into Nora's shoulder. Kael, come with us, she begged, voice cracking. Kael didn't flinch. Behind them, footsteps, gun clicks, voices barking orders through radios. He growled, low, measured, final. Then two men burst through the corridor's far end. Black uniforms, tactical vests, Serenex insignias, stitched in shadowed thread. They didn't expect a dog, especially not this dog. Kael lunged faster than either man could raise a weapon. The first guard went down screaming, teeth sinking into his forearm as he tried to lift his rifle. Kael twisted, using the weight of his own body like a blade, dragging the man down hard against the tile. The second one fired. Kael dropped low, the bullet sparking off the wall behind him. Nora pulled Maya down the left hall, every step an argument between fear and guilt. She wanted to go back, but Maya couldn't run, could barely stay conscious, and Kael had chosen. The sound of fighting rang behind them, shouts, metal crashing, the heavy thump of bodies. Kael was buying them seconds, inches, a future. Nora kicked open the emergency exit. A blast of cold night air hit her like a slap. She stumbled out into the tree line, lungs heaving, heart splintering, and then silence. Not from the wind, from behind. The alarm still echoed, but the struggle was gone. She turned back and saw him. Kael was limping out the door, bleeding, his harness torn, teeth stained red, but he had made it. He limped toward them, one paw dragging, head held high despite it. Nora dropped to her knees, gently laying Maya down. Kael! He collapsed in front of her, not unconscious, not broken, just finished. Nora crawled forward, cupping his blood-wet face with both hands. You stupid, brave, beautiful soul. Kael exhaled. His chest still rose, but slower now. He looked past her to Maya. The girl had crawled closer, her fingers brushing against his coat. And for the first time since they found her, she whispered, Safe. Kael blinked, just once, then let his head rest against the cold forest floor. Nora pressed her forehead to his. Tears slid down her cheeks. They didn't speak. They didn't have to, because some promises are louder than words, and Kael's had never changed. The building groaned like it was alive, screaming its last. Somewhere in the east wing, the first blast cracked through concrete. A rush of fire surged upward through the ventilation shafts, belching smoke down every corridor like black lungs exhaling ruin. Flames licked the walls, sirens blurred with sprinkler systems that never activated. The facility was dying, and it meant to take everything with it. Nora's boots skidded across scorched tile. Maya's limp body cradled in her arms. Blood dotted the girl's wrist, still raw from the restraints. She was awake now, barely but silent, eyes fluttering as if caught between two realities. Just hold on, Nora whispered, breath ragged. We're almost there. Behind her, Kael limped forward. Every step was pain. You could see it in his body, how the hind legs dragged, how each paw print left behind a smear of red. But he didn't stop, couldn't. He stayed within 10 feet of Nora, always between her and the dark. They passed through the west corridor, once a testing wing, now smoke-choked ruin. Steel doors melted inward, lights blinked overhead like dying stars. A pipe burst, spewing scalding steam into the air. Nora shielded Maya and ducked beneath it, skin prickling. Then Kael stopped. Just one paw frozen midair. He turned, his head sniffing sharply at the smoke. His ears lifted, not toward them, toward the east wing. "Nora," Miles' voice crackled over the comm, "you've got less than 2 minutes. Fire is moving fast. If you're not out—" "I know," she snapped, coughing. But Kael didn't follow. He was facing the wrong way now. Body still trembling, nose aimed toward the scorched hallway behind them. "What is it?" Nora asked. And then she heard it. A voice. Small, fragile, trapped. A whimper so faint it might have been the wind. But Kael didn't hesitate. He turned his whole body, muscles bunching like a spring, and limped into the smoke. "No!" Nora yelled. "Kael, come back!" But he was already gone. Nora dropped to her knees, setting Maya gently against the base of a toppled desk. The girl's eyes opened just enough to say, "He heard someone." Nora stared down the burning corridor and made the choice she always would. She ran after him. Flames flared around her. Every breath tasted like melted metal and fear. The walls pulsed heat through her gear. Her skin stung, and behind her, cracking, coughing, the facility crumbling. But ahead, through the firelight, a flicker of movement. Kael. He was standing guard at the edge of a broken doorway, body low, tail stiff. His ears twitched once, then flattened. He looked back at her just once and stepped inside. Nora followed. Inside was what used to be a holding cell, the kind designed to make people disappear. And in the far corner, a girl, no older than 12, bound, gagged, her eyes so wide, so terror-drenched, they barely seemed real. "Jesus," Nora whispered. She moved quickly, ignoring the pain in her own body. Unclipping the girl's bindings, she lifted her with effort, just skin and bones, barely breathing. Behind her, Kael whined. She turned. He didn't move. He was standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. Smoke thickened. She stumbled forward, coughing. "Let's go, Kael." He didn't budge. She reached for him. Kael backed up one step, just enough to make her pause. Then he did something she didn't expect. He nudged her softly, not toward himself, but toward the exit. He was staying. "No," she breathed. "Not again. I'm not leaving you here." The building shook hard. Part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, blocking the way they came. Fire rushed into the hallway like water, red and hungry. Kael turned to face it and barked once sharp, final, as if to say, "Go." Nora swallowed everything that was shattering in her. She ran. She burst through the fire exit into the night, lungs burning, arms full. She collapsed beside Maya, both girls alive, trembling, gasping. But her eyes weren't on them. They were locked on the door, still closed, still quiet, until a body pushed through. Kael, burned, bleeding, barely standing, but he staggered toward her, his breath ragged, tail twitching once before giving in to gravity. Nora didn't wait. She met him halfway and dropped to her knees, arms circling the last warrior out of hell. He leaned into her just long enough to let his weight settle, and his heart keep time with hers. And then darkness took him under. But this time it wasn't defeat. It was rest. The compound was collapsing around them, metal screaming as it buckled, walls bleeding fire and ash. Smoke curled through the air like ghosts mourning what was lost and what would never come back. Nora stumbled through the crumbling hallway with one girl in her arms, Maya beside her, barely upright. The emergency exit was inside, 10 steps away, maybe less. Kael limped ahead, blood dripping from one leg, soot clinging to his fur. But his eyes never wavered. Even in ruin, even in pain, he kept moving. And then he stopped. It wasn't the smoke that caught his attention, or the frums. It was the sound, faint, muffled. A cry, a single, broken cry, barely human, barely audible. Kael froze, ears perked. Then he turned sharply toward a hallway nearly consumed by flame. His body stiffened. Nora followed his gaze. "What is it?" she rasped. Kael took one step, then another. He looked back at her and whimpered, a high, trembling sound that didn't come from fear, but knowing. "No," she whispered, heart seizing. "Kael, no, please. We don't have time." But he moved forward again, and Nora saw it. Through the cracks in the heat-warped door, small fingers, reaching out. Another girl, trapped, smoke curling round her like a noose. Kael turned to Nora once more. His body trembled, chest heaving, but his eyes were steady. She hesitated, every instinct screaming to follow, but Kael stepped closer and nudged her thigh with his nose once, then again, a push, not for affection, for goodbye. "No," Nora choked, tears blurring her vision. "You don't have to do this." But Kael stepped back and ran in. His figure disappeared into the blackened door like a shadow folding into fire. Nora screamed, "Kael!" She lunged forward, but the heat hit like a hammer, knocking her to her knees. The air exploded, walls groaning, a muffled shout from inside. Then a gunshot, one, and silence. The kind that doesn't just fill the space, it hollows it. Nora collapsed beside the wall, her body shaking. Maya knelt with her, covering her mouth with both hands, tears streaking through ash on her face, and then smoke parted for one impossible moment. A shape stumbled out, small, the girl, covered in soot, barefoot, eyes wet with shock, but alive. Kael had let her out and stayed behind. Nora pulled the girl into her arms. Her hands were trembling too hard to hold her steady. Behind her, flames devoured the corridor. The door twisted on its hinges, then gave in to the fire. The entire wing collapsed. There was no more hallway, no more chance. Kael was gone. She didn't speak on the drive back, didn't cry, didn't blink. She sat in the back of the ambulance beside Maya and the rescued girl, one hand still stained with soot and blood, resting on Kael's empty harness. It smelled like smoke, like him. The girl leaned against her shoulder. "He didn't growl," she whispered. "He didn't bark." Nora turned. The girl looked up, voice shaking, "But I knew he wouldn't leave me." And for the first time, Nora let herself fall apart. The night cracked open as the last of the compound gave way. Flames clawing toward the stars, heat warping the dark into something ancient and merciless. Nora barely remembered how she got there. One arm wrapped around Maya, the other held the newly rescued girl. Her body as light as memory, breath shallow but steady. Behind them, the inferno raged, but they were out. They were alive. The world narrowed to that one truth. And for a moment, it was enough. Then she saw him, crawling, dragging himself through ash and gravel just beyond the firelight. Kael! His coat blackened, torn. Blood seeped from a jagged wound in his side. His hind legs no longer moved, but his front paws gripped the earth with one last command in them: stay with her. He collapsed halfway through the grass, but when Nora screamed his name, he lifted his head. Just enough, just once. She dropped to her knees, not caring how it burned, and pulled him into her lap. His breathing hitched. A tremor ran through his chest. His muzzle twitched against her forearm, as if checking, "Are you okay? Are they safe?" "You did it," she whispered. Tears mixed with soot as she brushed a trembling hand down his scarred face. His eyes fluttered, half-lidded, but they stayed on her. Steady, present, even now. There were no crowds, no medals, no flags, just the earth beneath them, softened by dew and ash, and the night sky above, indifferent and infinite, and them, one last time. She leaned down until her forehead touched his, her breath hitching through every word. "At ease, soldier," she whispered. The moment the words left her lips, his eyes closed, not from exhaustion, from permission. His last breath wasn't a gasp. It was a sigh. The kind you make when the work is done and the person you love is safe. She stayed like that for a long time. No one dared to speak. Not the paramedics who arrived minutes later. Not the officers who watched from a distance, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. Not even Maya, whose trembling hand found Nora's and held it through the silence. Kael lay still, head resting in her lap, gone. But not broken, not forgotten. Later that night, long after the embers stopped glowing and the last siren faded, Nora walked back to the field alone. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't wear her badge. She carried a folded American flag and Kael's harness, still warm with the memory of him. She knelt in the grass exactly where he'd fallen and whispered the only prayer she knew. "Thank you, not for surviving, but for choosing her." Every day, the news cycle moved on in under 72 hours. The fire on the edge of the city, labeled electrical malfunction. The explosion, accidental. The 2 rescued girls, mentioned only briefly. Juvenile victims requiring further evaluation. No one uttered the word Sarin X. No one mentioned the dog who did, saving them all. Nora sat in the back of the hearing room, stiff, silent. In her lap rested a sealed envelope, Kael's body cam footage, time-stamped bills, the intruder's patch, a hidden syringe, and photos Elsie had risked everything to save. The board accepted it all and quietly buried it. The summary read, "Due to insufficient corroboration and the presence of compromised sources, the submitted materials could not be independently verified." She stared at that sentence for 10 minutes, then stood and walked out. She never looked back. Her resignation letter was one line: "I no longer serve a truth that chooses silence over justice." No name, no signature, because names didn't matter anymore. At home, she muted the TV. Headlines rolled on. New mayor, a police dog show, a fluff piece on heroic containment of a warehouse fire. No one asked why a refrigerated building had holding rooms, or why two drugged girls were found in the dark. That afternoon, a young officer rang the bell. "From Records Division," he said, handing her a cardboard box. Inside, Kael's folded vest, a generic certificate, a badge, and a service ribbon meant to be pinned posthumously. No name, no rank, not even Kael. She stepped into the backyard, air tinged with smoke. Spring had arrived, but the garden hadn't noticed. She sat in the grass, ran her fingers over the vest, whispered, "They'll forget, but I won't." And then, in the dirt, she began to dig. The soil was stubborn, rocky. She didn't wear gloves. Each scrape, every blister, was her way of saying, "I remember." She planted lavender first, rows of it, deep purple and fragrant. Kael's her favorite. She used to wave sprigs under his nose during nightmares. One breath and he'd stop trembling. Maybe he remembered her scent too. Maybe to him that smell meant home. The garden took weeks, not because it had to, but because she needed it to. Each morning she'd wake before the city stirred. Kael's bed still lay beside hers, untouched, unmoved. She'd step barefoot onto the cold wood floor, open the back door, dew on her toes, sunlight cutting through haze, and silence no longer suffocating, just watchful. Maybe it was memory, maybe something more. She planted rosemary, daisies, thyme, a winding stone path through it all, like one Kael might have followed, nose low, tail high. And in the center, a single white rose bush. Not because he loved roses, but because it would bloom last. She carved the plaque herself, burned the letters slowly into cedar. Some heroes never need a badge. It wasn't tall, it wasn't loud, just there waiting for someone who cared enough to see it. One afternoon, Maya visited. She lingered at the gate. Nora said nothing. She simply opened it. They walked side by side through lavender rows. Maya reached down, grazing petals with her fingertips. "I think he'd like it," she whispered. Nora nodded. "He used to roll in it, like he didn't care how silly he looked." Maya smiled. "He never barked when he found me. He just stayed." Nora's voice was quiet. "He always knew." That evening, Nora sat in the garden, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Lavender wrapped the air like memory. A single deer barked in the distance, sharp, far away. She looked at the stars, closed her eyes, whispered, "You're still here?" The next morning, she found it, tucked under the garden gate. No return address, just her name, written in careful cursive, Nora. Inside, a letter and a small drawing on torn sketch paper. "Dear Nora, it took time to find the right words, but I needed to try. I remember the silence most when they took us. It was all noise, doors slamming, screaming, orders shouted. But when Kael came, everything stilled. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He just stood between me and the dark, and I knew I was safe. I don't know how he knew to choose me, but when he did, it felt like a wall rising from the ground. He didn't let the noise reach me. I never cried when they took us, not once, but I cried when he died, because I knew he did it for us. Even in pain, even when he couldn't breathe, I saw peace on his face. He had finished the mission. You once said he wasn't just a dog, he was your partner. I think you were wrong. He was all of us. Every girl who needed someone to walk into the fire and say, 'You don't get to break her.' Thank you for loving him like that. I hope this drawing does him justice. Love." Maya. Nora opened the sketch. Kael stood in the center, chest tall, ears alert. On either side, Two towering shadows stretched beyond the page, and between them a beam of light. Kael stood like a pillar, not wild, not afraid, just certain, guarding that light. Beneath the sketch, Maya had written, "He didn't bark, he stayed." Nora clutched the letter to her chest, not crying, just feeling all of it, what it meant to be remembered. That afternoon, she framed the drawing, placed it in a waterproof case beside the cedar plaque. Below it, she carved, "Some stayed when no one else did." Kael, K944 Trus, protector, memory keeper, guardian of the light. The garden was quiet, but for the first time, the silence no longer hurt. It held her. The room wasn't large, just an old rec center space converted with mats on the floor, mirrors on one wall, and the occasional buzz of a faulty overhead light. There was nothing fancy here, no banner, no anthem, just air that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and lavender oil, but it was enough. For some, it was the first safe space they'd entered in years. And for Nora, it was the only place she didn't feel like a ghost of what she used to be. She stood at the front of the class, barefoot, sleeves rolled, voice steady. "Again," she said gently. Around her, half a dozen girls, some barely 10, others nearly grown, mimicked her stance. They weren't perfect. One girl kept flinching, another bit her lip every time someone moved too quickly behind her. But they were there, and they were trying. That mattered more than any technique. Hands up, elbows in, eyes forward. "You're not prey." Say it with me. The voices were small at first. "I am not prey." Again. "I am not prey." Louder now. "I am not prey." Nora gave a nod of quiet approval and stepped back. She scanned the room, not just the form and discipline, but the tension behind their shoulders, the flicker of old fear in their eyes. Some were survivors of trafficking. Others had grown up in households where silence was taught louder than screams. Each had their reason. Each had chosen to be here. At the far corner of the room, just beside Nora's desk, lay a German shepherd with amber eyes and a coat touched by sable shadow. Valor. He didn't wear a vest, no insignia, no leash. Just a navy blue bandana stitched with a small patch that read, "In memory of Kael Peacekeeper." Valor rested with his chin on his paws, eyes half closed but alert, in the way only a shepherd could be, listening not just to the sounds, but the silences between them. When one of the girls froze mid-kick, overwhelmed by memory, Valor rose silently and crossed the ruined room. He didn't nudge her. He didn't bark or draw attention. He just sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The girl didn't look down, but her breathing slowed. She finished the motion, and Valor returned to his corner, tail giving a single, satisfied flick. Later, as the session ended and the girls trickled out, some with smiles, others with tears held tight in clenched jaws, Nora sat at her desk, arms crossed over her chest, like a shield she no longer needed. Valor padded over and rested his head on her knee. "You did good today," she whispered, ruffling the fur between his ears. He huffed softly and closed his eyes. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting the last rays of golden light through the blinds. They danced across the room in slow-moving lines, like the shadows of prison bars, but in reverse. Here, the lines didn't trap. They marked freedom earned. On the desk sat a worn file folder labeled Unit Archive, K94427, Kael. Inside his badge photo, medical notes, the medal he never wore. And the final page, a crayon sketch, now laminated, of Kael standing between shadows, guarding the light. It stayed with her, not because she couldn't let go, but because some memories aren't meant to be let go. They're meant to guide. Every Wednesday night, Nora left the door unlocked 5 minutes early, just in case a new girl showed up without the courage to knock. More often than not, someone did. And Valor, he always met them at the threshold, not barking, not demanding, just waiting, like Kael once did, like some part of him still did, through blood, through memory, through mission. That evening, as Nora packed the mats and turned off the lights, she paused at the doorway and looked back. The room was empty now, but it didn't feel hollow. It felt ready. And for the first time in a long time, so did she. The email came at 2 a.m. No subject line, no signature. Just a single hyperlink and 3 words. They released it. Nora sat upright in bed, her heart already racing. Valor stirred on the floor, his ears twitching at her sudden movement. But he didn't rise. Not yet. Her hands trembled as she clicked the link. The screen blinked, then loaded slowly, like the moment was stretching Timon on purpose. And then it appeared. A press release from World Guard International, a human rights coalition notorious for cracking sealed records and whistleblower testimonies. The headline read, Exposed, Project Sarin X Files Declassified, over 12,000 pages of experimental trials. The subheading was colder, Involuntary Subjects, Neurochemical Trauma Bonding, Canine Compliance Units, Cognitive Disruption, Testing on Minors. Nora scrolled further, past medical scans and internal memos, until a thumbnail caught her breath mid-throat. A paused security feed. Time-stamped 2 months ago. In the frame, Kael, head low, eyes locked. His body still recovering, blocking 2 armed guards in a dim hallway. Behind him, Maya, barefoot, shaking. Kael never growled, never flinched. He just stood his ground. A single line beneath the footage read, The Dog Who Chose to Remember. By sunrise, the footage had gone viral. It spread like fire across every platform, reposted by journalists, activists, veterans, and rescue communities. It was translated into 23 languages in 48 hours. News anchors called it the whistle heard round the world. Others called it a dog's silent rebellion. But to Nora, it was something simpler. It was the truth, finally seen. She sat at the edge of her front porch, coffee going cold in her hands, as helicopters circled distant news stations, and a neighborhood boy across the street asked his mom if he could be brave like the shepherd on TV. Nora didn't feel brave. She felt cracked open. For months, her reports had been ignored. Her badge had meant nothing. The files she'd risked her career to unearth had been buried by bureaucracy. But one grainy video of a dog who couldn't speak had made the world listen. Because Kael hadn't needed words. Just the courage to stand when everyone else looked away. Emails poured in, some from survivors, others from parents, a few from lawmakers demanding hearings, and one from a mother in rural Argentina simply read, My daughter was taken by people who used those drugs. They said I was crazy, but now I know I'm not. Thank you, and thank him. Nora saved every message. each one like a piece of Kael's legacy finding a new place to land. A week later, The Guardian published a full expose titled "The Program That Used Dogs as Weapons and the One Who Refused." The photo beneath it wasn't dramatic, just Kael's profile, ears up, eyes focused, standing in the hallway beside Maya, a stillness that spoke louder than any roar. Valor sat beside Nora as she clicked through more archived clips. There was footage of Kael in the training compound, reacting to unnatural stimuli, lights, sirens, fear pheromones. Each time his body hesitated, but his eyes always searched for the nearest human, as if instinct alone wasn't enough. He needed to understand, needed to connect. That's what made him different. That's what made them fear him. At a press conference, an activist read Kael's name aloud as part of a global memorial for unacknowledged animal service members. Behind her stood a steel statue, a German shepherd mid-stride, muscles tensed, one paw forward. No weapon, no leash, just posture. Like he was still choosing to protect, even in metal. Nora watched the broadcast in silence, her hand resting on Valor's back. And for the first time since the fire, she cried not from grief, but from something rarer. Validation. Not just for Kael, but for the instinct she refused to betray. The voice that told her the story wasn't over, even when they tried to bury it under ash. Later that night, she found a package on her porch. No return address. Inside, a worn collar, with a single tag engraved, "Kael, duty fulfilled." Taped beneath it, a note in shaky handwriting. "My brother worked at Sarin X. He died last year. I found this in his storage box. I think your partner earned it back." Nora stared at the collar for a long time, then placed it on the mantel, beneath a frame that held two things: a photo of Kael's eyes locked on the horizon, and Maya's drawing, him guarding the light. Kael never asked to be remembered, but now the world did, and that was enough. The morning was soft, not quiet, but soft, like the world had finally learned how to speak without raising its voice. Nora stood by the kitchen window, a mug of warm tea cupped in her hands. The scent of lavender drifted in through the screen, stirred gently by the breeze. It danced through the hallway, over old photo frames, down to the sun-dappled porch, where the newest heartbeat of the house lay curled in sleep. Valor, his breathing slow, steady, his fur rising with each breath. He lay in the same patch of garden where Kael used to rest, just beneath the Japanese maple that had once shaded a warhorse of a dog with pain in his spine and fire in his eyes. Nora opened the back door and stepped out barefoot. The grass was cool beneath her toes, and dewdrops clung to her footprints like echoes. She didn't call Valor. She didn't need to. The pup stirred as she neared, lifting his head just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were different than Kael's, less burdened, more curious. But in the light, there was something familiar, a glint of loyalty, not yet tested, but already offered. He thumped his tail once and let it rest. Nora sat beside him in the grass, the hem of her sweater brushing his side. She looked out over the yard. The garden had grown wild in a beautiful way, lavender spilling over the stone path, daisies creeping into the basil bed, bees humming with no agenda but to live, and in the center stood a wooden plaque, simple and worn. Some heroes never need a badge. She closed her eyes. There were no more raids, no gunshots, no headlines, just wind, lavender, and the low rumble of a young dog dreaming. Sometimes she still saw Kael in her sleep, not broken, not bleeding, but standing in the hallway outside Maya's room, tail still, eyes locked, an unspoken sentence in the shape of devotion. He never barked, never whimpered, just stood between darkness and whatever came next. There were memories that haunted, and then there were memories that guided. Kael had become the latter, a compass of silence, a shadow that comforted rather than chased. Nora reached out, letting her fingers run through Valor's coat. "You don't have to fill his paws," she whispered. "Just walk beside me." The pup shifted, placing his head on her thigh. She smiled, not the brittle smile of survival, but the kind that softens the bones. Inside, a letter from Maya sat folded on the kitchen table, one she sent after her first college self-defense class. Nora had been invited to speak. She declined, not because it hurt, but because she finally believed she didn't need to say everything out loud anymore. Some stories, once told, live better in the spaces they leave behind. From somewhere deeper in the garden, a wind chime sang, and for a moment Nora swore she saw movement by the plaque, a trick of the light maybe, or maybe not. Kael never did like long goodbyes. She looked down at Valor, already drifting off again, the sun warming the fur between his ears, and she said it not like a goodbye, not like a prayer, but like a truth that had taken her a lifetime to understand. "Some memories don't haunt," she said softly. "They guide." And for the first time in a long time, Nora Vance let herself rest. And finally, she smiled. The story of Kael isn't just about bravery. It's about the quiet strength found in loyalty, in healing, and in choosing love even after loss. German shepherds like Kael remind us that some heroes walk on four legs, asking for nothing, yet giving everything. Their loyalty doesn't fade with time, and their silence often carries more wisdom than 1,000 words. Through Kael's journey, we're reminded that animals are not just companions. They're protectors, healers, and mirrors to the best parts of our humanity. They guide us through our darkest moments, stand between us and harm, and when their time is done, they leave behind something no tragedy can take: purpose. Let Kael's story inspire us to listen more closely, to love more deeply, and to honor every creature that stands by our side, not for what they do, but for who they are. If this story moved you, share it. Celebrate the animals who've stood by you. And remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear fur. And never stop watching over us, even after they're gone.